And we are back on the build phase. I'm mrben, and today I want to talk about ban and replace. So if you're a newer member of the Versus community, this may be a concept that you've potentially heard about, but haven't really interacted with or seen occur in real time. Because other than somebody saying, hey, you can't play that Thanos, you have to play this Thanos, or saying the same thing for Cosmo or saying the same thing for Singularity. The ban and release concept has actually only been put into effect in our game 3 times total. Before I get right into kind of my critique and thoughts on ban and replace, though, let's rewind all the way back to before any cards had received any kinds of balance adjustments within our game. So I think anybody who started playing in 2015 with the original Marvel Battles base box, it became real obvious real fast that Thanos was the best main character in that box by a massive margin. He got supercharged with the release of A-Force, and that's largely due to the inclusion of Goblin Queen in that box. So all 3 of the cards that have gotten banned and replaced, 2 of them appeared in the base set, and 1 of them appeared in A-Force. So the concept, I guess, for anyone who wasn't around at the time when this was being discussed kind of actively, I talked to Danny Mandel in 2016, and he talked about how, yes, this was before anything had happened as far as balance adjustments. And he talked about how, yes, we kind of identified that Thanos is a power level problem. And the philosophy was we don't want to take a card away. The players bought the card. If we're going to ban a card, we want to replace that card with something else, give them a new way to continue to essentially have the card, but have a better, a more balanced version of it. So if you think about this in like digital card games, when a nerf or a buff happens, you still have your card, it just works a little bit differently. Now, we do have a similar concept in paper and ink card games, and that is errata. The problem with errata is if you don't know about it, you can't play with it. So at a tournament level, if we're going to errata a card and say, hey, the card may say X, but it's actually going to do Y for the purposes of this event. If you're going to a tournament and you don't get up on what the rules and the requirements are for that format, that's on you. That's your problem. But for a casual player, there's a lot of casual versus players who maybe never go to the Facebook or never look at Upper Deck's blog, and they would have both no way to know what the errata is and also wouldn't necessarily realize that it had even happened, much less not knowing where it is. What? This card doesn't do this? And that kind of fragments and splits up the player base in a way that I don't think anybody thinks is good. So the decision was made by the powers that be that errata is not going to be the way that they handle balance changes. Or at least that was the plan way back in 2016. Now, I don't want this to derail into a conversation about errata, but I do think Super Awesome Games kind of figured out a way to pull that sort of thing off through the use of keywords. So if we look at Mimic, for example, Mimic's actual text is just a keyword, and you don't know what that does unless you reference the rule book. So for them to be able to essentially errata Mimic and change how he worked after the fact didn't require any change on any text on the actual card itself. So while again, there are certainly criticisms that can be made of relying on these multi-layer powers being kind of packed into a single keyword with no reminder text on the card. There are some drawbacks and some pitfalls that could be found there. Overall, I think the idea of Super Awesome Games taking their wildest ideas, like Wyatt Wingfoot has not needed an errata or any kind of balance adjustment, but you can almost see the logic there. Hey, we're going to try this really crazy thing. If it doesn't work out because there's a mechanical problem, which is another thing that's happened in our games, or if it doesn't work out because there's a balance problem, which is kind of what I'm going to be talking about today, we can change it just by changing an updated text document on the internet. We don't have to reach out and touch everybody's individual card because the card still says he knows he's in a card game. We just change what card game means. So I think that's a pretty okay place. There's trade-offs both ways. Yeah, again, you can criticize not having the reminder text on the card, but you could also criticize when they want to make a balance adjustment and can't because they don't have a way to push that out to the masses. And errata that is contradicting text that's actually on the cards is a lot harder to enforce or deal with or make sure people are even aware of than, hey, I don't know what this card. If the card forces you to go look up a rule, you're more likely to find the most updated version of the rule if you're playing at kind of the tournament level. And again, at the tournament level, it's on you to know what the cards do and what rule set and format you're operating under. So, okay, let's set errata aside and let's swing back over to the idea of banning a card. So, when I talked to Danny, I talked about how, like, Captain America in particular in the base set is very weak. And I said, I'd really like to see this guy get buffed. Having, at the time, I was playing a lot of Hearthstone, and seeing cards get buffed and nerfed was something that I kind of grown to really appreciate about playing card games in the digital space. Obviously, this is way more difficult in paper and ink. I can't expect my real world card games to have the same kind of flexibility as digital assets. But nonetheless, I wanted to have a good Captain America. And he said at the time, well, we're not going to balance adjust a card for being too weak. Like if we miss the mark, I don't want to put words in his mouth. If a card comes out and it feels a little flat, they're not going to do a ban and replace for that reason. They're only going to do that in the case of something really disrupting or really breaking the game. And to be fair, they have only used it in those cases, but they haven't actually banned or replaced a card since Singularity. So Thanos and Cosmo were both banned and replaced within the Legacy box, which came out in 2016. And I believe the Singularity reprint came out in Shield versus Hydra, which I think would have been fall of 2017. I may not have the exact dates perfect because I'm kind of going from memory here. But the point is, they haven't used this tool in a really long time. But all three of the times they used it, these were cards that had kind of significant impacts on the game. So I guess for someone who's new, let's run down what these cards did roughly. So Thanos had the ability to gain experience whenever any character entered a KO pile. And if you could get one location of each of the four colors, he then had an ability that basically said win the game. It didn't. It said a bunch of other things, but it KO'd resources, wounded main characters, emptied the opponent's hand. It did so many things that you basically won the game off one gauntlet. If you got it twice, you were sure to win. So this set up a situation in games where people were just racing to see who could get gauntlet first, and it really homogenized the meta. We saw tons of Thanos and only Thanos. At the second ever Gen Con versus event, both players at the final table played Thanos and after the game ripped him up to kind of make a statement of like, hey, this card is a real problem. Powerful cards are not something we want to avoid. We want powerful cards. We don't want everything to be exactly the same. Having some things that are a little bit out of balance is okay. Thanos, particularly Thanos after Goblin Queen was released, was more than okay. He was oppressive and kind of preventing other decks from even having a chance to be played. And we don't necessarily want that. Cosmo did a thing that was like the most negative play experience thing possible. So one of the promises of the new Versus game was you get to play with your main character and they're out there for the whole game. So a criticism I had for the original Versus game is I want to play with Batman. And so I can play Batman on turn 2, but then because of uniqueness, I can't play Batman on turn 3 or turn 4. I can't play another, and maybe there isn't a good Batman until these higher turns. So if I'm not going to play a Batman until like Fat Bat on turn 7, then I end up playing my Batman deck and not actually getting to play with Batman, which was not the coolest thing. So versus the new versus 2PCG brought in this idea of the main character, where the character I want to play with for most decks most of the time is the most important thing in my deck. The whole deck supports that character, and most importantly for me as a player, as a fan, the character that my focus is on is in play the entire game for the most part. I realize there's ways to remove main characters from play, blah blah blah, but generally speaking, if I want to play with a team that's supporting Iron Man, I can have Iron Man in play for the whole game. And that feels great. I think that was a really, really good idea coming into versus 2PCG. They also printed Cosmo, which is a card that turns off a character's abilities, just blanks their text box until Cosmo leaves play. And if you target your opponent's main character, you can essentially make it so that they can't do the really cool thing that I just described of having, Batman in play for the whole game. Now you can't do that because Cosmo has essentially turned them into a nothing, just a blank card. Making Cosmo, so I think they overshot with the adjustment on Cosmo. This is again another little aside here. I think Cosmo should have lasted until the start of your next turn. So I play my Cosmo on my turn one. For your turn one, your main character has no powers, and then at the start of my next turn, he gets his powers back, as opposed to only making it last until the end of my turn. So I think they overreacted just a little bit with the Cosmo nerf, although there definitely are decks that have still made use of Cosmo as a one turn, hey, let's turn off Jessica Jones. Hey, let's turn off that person's flight. So he isn't unplayable, but I would have liked to see him adjusted not quite as far as they did. Um, that said, both of these cards definitely needed adjustments. Now, the last adjustment they made a little bit later in the game's life, and that was Singularity. Originally, the Singularity supporting character had a power that triggered automatically at the end of turn that allowed you to take any number of characters in play on your side and remove them from the game. Then, at the start of your next turn, or when Singularity gets stunned, you bring all those characters back out and all of their appear effects trigger again. So this created loops where you could loop 6-drop Iron Man and just continually refresh your resources. I think Bert's, gosh, what was the name of that deck now? His Black Cat deck, was it Black Parade? Uh, I should have looked this up before. It was Black something. The deck that Bert won Midwinter with, it was a masterclass in abusing this kind of singularity loop and getting Swain, getting Iron Man, and being able to create a lock that just totally locked your opponent out of being able to do anything. They adjusted how singularity worked, so now you have to actually pay for the effect. It costs a blue. Oh, you know what? Now that I think about it, I think the deck Bert played was actually with the new version of Singularity because he was using Swain to pay for the blue. So bad example. Nonetheless, they made this adjustment right before or right as the Shield versus Hydra set came out, and I think that was pretty smart given Hydra has the soldier ability, which is an appear effect that puts -1 counters on people, and more importantly, Shield has the agent ability, which is an appear effect that lets you look at cards on top of your deck and rearrange them. So making Singularity have to actually cost something, especially when you're introducing this degree of powerful appear effects, really just made sense. So all three of the cards that were banned and replaced, I think it was probably, well, not probably, it was definitely justified at the time that it happened. Given where the game has gone now, I'm not totally sure that original Thanos would even be able, like, I don't think Outriders is going to be afraid of Thanos gauntleting them. Probably. I'm not sure. Regardless, after that happened, so we're talking like 2017, we have not seen another card banned at all. Uh, not a single time. And I have to guess, I have to wait. So there was resistance to, I have two things I want to say here. Let me try not to say them at the same time. On the one hand, we know that the ban and replace idea was instituted because there was a, hey, we can't tell players they can't use cards that they paid for type of mentality, and they didn't want to take things away from people that they wanted to play with. I totally get that. So the idea of replacing this other thing, but those cards don't just come out of the ether. In order to have all those extra copies of Thanos, that means they have to be printed. That has to be paid for. And then somebody who buys the legacy box, if they don't have the Marvel base set, they have these cards that don't really, they can still kind of use, they can use the Cosmo, but they can't really even use the Thanos because they don't have the other cards that make that Thanos work without buying. So there's kind of a fragmentation there that I suspect between the cost and the sort of basic logistical hurdles of implementing ban and replace. That is why they eventually abandoned, and I am willing to use that word. I think they have abandoned the concept of ban and replace within our game. The next concept that came up for kind of balance adjustments was featured formats. Now, featured formats didn't only serve as a way to balance the various competitive formats. And again, pretty much this entire conversation only applies to tournament players. If you're playing at your kitchen table, you can do whatever you want with your cards. There's nobody that makes it so you can't play with the original Cosmo. There's nobody that makes it so you can't house rule and ban a card from your play group, etc. So just going forward, this I probably should have framed it that way at the top of the show, but this is mostly focused on competitive application because casuals don't care when things get banned. So when we are looking at the competitive environment, it seems like the next idea that SAG had was formats. Now, formats, again, as I started to say before I interrupted myself, didn't only serve a balancing purpose, they also served a novelty purpose, uh, in my opinion. And maybe there's a third role where it makes it more accessible for new players, which is totally valid too. But by creating formats where what cards you're allowed to play are restricted or incentivized in different ways, it means cards that were otherwise gathering dust in your binder are now playable within the silo of this particular format. And that's awesome. I like the idea of seeing more cards see play. It's why I kind of wish there was actually a draft scene and any kind of like having some kind of a draft competitive environment other than just occasionally at another tournament would be really cool. But it's hard to pull that kind of stuff off when the when the game isn't being sold in packs. So, and this is a little bit of a stretch, I admit, but it feels to me like formats are a way to, because we're allowing ourselves to see other cards through restrictions and incentives, it kind of scratches a tiny little fraction of the itch that draft would scratch fully. But it's also a way to balance the cards. So, and that's what the main thing that I want to talk about today is game balance. So, formats kind of worked. Well, and they did, they were a smashing success in a lot of ways. But with regard to balance, while I do think it achieved the goal, if we hypothetically say, and this is trying to be really careful here, there may have been other goals with formats, but if one of the goals is trying to create more balanced competitive environments, I think it's fair to say that for the most part, formats have achieved that. Not every format has been a winner, not every format has been balanced, but generally speaking, formats have been more or less. There's a couple of really strong decks, there's a larger number of kind of tier 2 decks, and that's kind of what we want to see. Now, I think about some of the like photographic formats where it was like you play Outriders or you lose, or you play Mayor or you lose, and that's a little too restrictive. I would not argue that Photographic 2, I think it was called Double Exposure, I don't think that was necessarily a successful format, but broadly speaking, I think formats have been great for the game and have done a pretty good job at breaking up the card pool and kind of preventing these negative play experience card interactions from happening. The problem is when a team has, like Femme Fatales, an extremely problematic main character and an extremely problematic supporting character, those teams just get put on the bench for huge amounts of time. There's characters that I might want to play on Femme Fatales, but if the way Super Awesome Games is choosing to structure the format is by only letting certain teams be playable or by outright banning other teams, often it's too clumsy a tool. Like the problem's Dark Phoenix, and instead of saying, hey, we're going to ban Dark Phoenix, we're just going to not let you play Femme Fatales for however long. That is a wart. That is I think flaw in the overall system. And when this format system first rolled out, I was thrilled because I suspected they were going to try to do something like Magic the Gathering blocks, where the release date of a particular set has more to do with whether or not it's playable than anything else. And they didn't do that. They stayed away from that for actually a really long time. And it's only been within the last couple of years where we've seen formats that check things. Now, they don't frame it cards released from this date to this date. They say cards released within this volume, but the volumes, well, up until the COVID shipping delays, the volume does indicate when the set was released. Like volume 1 was all the issues that came out in 2018, I think. That's a long time ago for my old brain to remember. But the when they switched to the issues and giant size issues and arcs distribution model, that would have been volume one. So I was critical of the idea that it was going to say, hey, you can't play with these cards just because they're old. But I think I was a little bit wrong on that point because I look at something like the second chance format where it was very much time gated. It was cards that had this release date or what's legal within this format for the most part. There are some exceptions, I know. But I thought that worked out pretty well as a format, and we're seeing more of those going forward. And again, I don't ever want to come across like anything that the specific issues I'm talking about are the only issue. So I understand that another concern in structuring formats so that you can only play cards from the last couple of years, that is another nod towards making the game accessible to newer players, especially as some of these older sets like Legacy, A-Force, Aliens, as these sets become harder and harder to find, if these cards just aren't available for players to get, then that makes it impossible for a new player to get into the game. Another sort of symptom could be the reprints we just saw of basic locations from the base set and from one of those very early issues in the issue arc distribution model. So we do have to accept that the game needs to be accessible to newer players because we need newer players in order for the game to survive and thrive. That's just a fact. So I have come around on the idea of having time gate type formats where, hey, in this format, maybe there's other restrictions too. Like you can only play with main characters from these teams, and you can also only use cards from this specific expansion and after. I played in this kind of format in Magic the Gathering for years, and it was fine. And I initially was kind of hostile to it in Versus for all the LCG reasons. Like, I want to play with the cards that I want to play with, blah, blah, blah. But I've kind of come around to the notion that time restricted formats. Let me start over. In order for us to naturally, as players, to naturally be incentivized to play new cards, a couple of things have to happen, or a couple of things could happen to create that incentive. One, the new cards could be super cool, and you just want to play them because they're awesome, even though maybe they're not necessarily more powerful. Two, you just power creep. You just have cards get better and stronger, so old stuff is always objectively worse than whatever is the newest stuff is. And three, you could have some kind of format that forces you to play the new stuff. And power creep left unchecked becomes a problem really quickly. I don't ever necessarily want to live in a versus world where cards out of like really strong cards from the early set are looked at as like a joke. Like if we ever have a plot twist that comes out that makes Think Again look ridiculous, that would be kind of wild to me. And arguably, there are some other plot twists out there that kind of are Think Again plus, so to speak, kind of like Friend from Work is an example. But overall, the general principle I'm driving at is that I think we want to have a game where the overall power level is within some pretty established error bars. Yeah, maybe there's the occasional outlier card that's way too powerful, and there's the occasional card that's like kind of a stinker. But for the most part, no matter what expansion you get, you have kind of a general idea of what a three drop should be stat wise, power wise. And again, outliers exist, and we want outliers because they're exciting. Generally speaking, we kind of have a good idea of what kind of the baseline power level is from set to set to set across many years within our game. And I think that's pretty healthy. And one of the ways that they can kind of enforce that is by leaning heavily into the other incentives to get people to buy new cards. Because the new cards are cool, whether it's thematically or mechanically, they're doing something interesting, something new, but not necessarily super powered, not necessarily the power creep part of it, and of course formats. And this is kind of where the whole crux of this episode is focused on how these formats have kind of changed and affected how we've balanced our game over the years. So I think it's likely that we're going to see more formats going forward that make it so you're not allowed to play, particularly those first couple years of expansion. So we're talking Marvel base set, A Force, Defenders, Legacy, Predator, Monsters, Aliens. I definitely swapped Aliens and Predator in the order there, and Shield versus Hydra. So that was the first 2 full years of the game. And that's all the stuff that came out before they introduced the issues and arcs model where we get the cigarette packs with the occasional 200 card pack. I think we're going to see more formats where a lot of those older cards are not allowed to be played. And that's largely going to come down to we want new players to be able to play in the premier featured formats. We want new players to have access to these cards. And if every seven drop has to be better than like Jungle Hunter in order to see play, then a lot of seven drops will just never see play. So structuring formats where some of these older, maybe mistakes, maybe I it's hard for me to, given some of the other balance issues that our game has had. I'm looking at you, Dark Phoenix. It's hard for me to call Jungle Hunter a mistake, but that guy was just so crazy powerful, so crazy strong. The ability to just ramp out of nowhere and then also be like, if you look at every other ramp card in the game, they can't fight. They're weak stats. They don't do a whole lot. Jungle Hunter came down and could swing and not get cracked back and hit mass. It was too much. He did way too much in that one card. Although, again, I think Dark Phoenix is probably a better example of a super overpowered supporting character. So if we see these formats, again, this is a concept I was against and was really adamant that there's got to be a better way. But now that I've spent many years with some of these older cards, I think I'm kind of ready to let them sit in the binder for a while. I'm ready for formats where some of these old staples are not playable, and maybe that'll reset things a little bit. You know, one of the reasons I look at, say, turn 2 and 3, 3 in particular, as wanting to get 6 attack out on the board is because that high water mark in terms of having an aggressively statted aggro deck, that high water mark was largely set by Primeval. Now I know Primeval is a 2 drop, but he has 2 health, so often playing him on 2, you're getting that 6 attack there, and you're getting that big 6 attack on turn 3 for relatively small investment. It's hard to play other cards when such powerful cards exist. Now, of course, you can make that choice, and people should make the choices that sort of fit their play pattern. But if you're playing at a competitive table, and what you're trying to do is win by playing the best cards, you do kind of get siloed into a lot of these. Ghost is another example. There's a lot of stuff in the Predators box that was really good. You get siloed into playing these kind of specific cards in this play pattern. And having formats that break that up, whether by restricting team affiliations or main characters or costs or health values, or yes, I now concede the date that a set was released. All of those variables should be levers that we're willing to pull, knobs that we're willing to adjust to create formats that are novel, fun, and balanced. I want to see all those things. I started off today wanting to talk specifically about ban and replace. And we've kind of taken a long walk through the history of different methods that have been utilized within the history of Versus to create balanced, fun, competitive play spaces. And I think mostly I have positive things to say. Now, again, you get me on a specific format. There are a few formats that I will absolutely shred because I don't like that this slipped through. There's interactions that I really do think should either be errated or banned out of the game. I'm looking at you, Mayor, Parallel Dimension. That just doesn't feel right to me. And I think a lot of people can agree that like Kate into Kelly doesn't feel great. And if the only way we're going to restrict that kind of stuff is by essentially making Kate unplayable forever, that does feel like a little bit of a bummer. But there is a shining hope on the horizon. There is a white knight swooping in to save us, and I think that might be the incursion format, which is kind of a counterintuitive thing to say because sort of the hallmark of incursion is that it's removing cards from play. But the point is, incursion, I believe, is meant to be a scalpel, to steal an idiom from the Modern Council, they talked about approaching their ban list with a scalpel. And good. We don't want to necessarily go in willy nilly and ban things that don't need to be banned. What we want to create is novel play experiences where the maximum number of cards in our binders are playable in novel, fun ways. And balance is a large part of creating those novel situations, because if it's really obvious that the best 2-drop in the format is X, then the majority of people are going to play X. If it's really obvious that the best main character, there's one that's just better than everybody else, people gravitate towards that. Now, certain personality types, of course, are repelled by what is the popular thing, and they want to do something different simply to prove that they can, or for whatever reason. Or maybe you personally don't like it. That was my beef with Outriders. I like aggro decks. I just didn't like how Outriders played for whatever reason. I think all that can be like personal preference does play a role in this, sure. But I'm speaking kind of in aggregate, I'm speaking in generalities. And to be fair, I don't think any format should necessarily be structured around any singular player's personal preference. So again, I acknowledge personal preference exists, but I'm kind of setting that aside for the this. I was going to say discussion, but I guess it's more of a monologue. So kind of to wrap things up here, to kind of bring it into a conclusion point, I think ban and replace as a concept largely failed. And I think that the cost of creating those extra cards and figuring out what expansions you could tuck them into plays a role in that. I don't know that. I have no inside information on that, but I think that is borne out by the facts as I see them. I'm happy to hear counter opinions. If anybody has one, holler at me on Discord and I will debate this with you if you wish. Or maybe you'll convince me. But largely, I think ban and replace has been abandoned by Upper Deck. Another balancing tool that I started talking about at the beginning was the errata, and I kind of went into depth about how I think they found a clever way to handle cards that they think might need errata with that keyword packaging, which has its drawbacks. I mentioned them at the top of the show. And finally, formats. And formats have, for the most part, been pretty clumsy in terms of handling specific cards that need addressed, but have been pretty excellent in giving us mostly balanced, fun, novel formats. And Incursion. I think what Incursion does well is it puts everything on the table, and they're going to do what, in my opinion, they should have done all along and just ban the cards that didn't work. I do not want to live in a world where Super Awesome Games makes every card with the idea that, oh, we want to make sure this doesn't come out and need to be banned. We want to make. I do think they should have an eye on balance. I do think they should have an eye on making cards that function in intuitive, reasonable ways. But one of the things I think we all love about this game is how ridiculous Super Awesome Games gets at points. Cards like Wyatt Wingfoot, that's one of my favorite cards ever in the game, and that concept is absurd. It's absurd to have a second hand, a second resource. It's ridiculous, but it's really fun. And I want Super Awesome Games to feel the freedom to make a Dark Phoenix. And then once it gets into players' hands, and for a while I was on the Dark Phoenix train. I didn't think it was going to be the end of the world when she got previewed. I enjoyed playing with her for a while, and then it reached a point where I had like my 50th stalemate where it's Dark Phoenix versus Dark Phoenix, and we both ripped enough concepts out of the game that neither of us could push through a win condition because we didn't have superpowers, we didn't have keywords, we didn't have counters, couldn't play plot twists, and we're just staring at each other. Those kind of stalemate game states, while it may be a minority, I know certainly I've talked to players who have never had that, but they do happen and they suck. And that's a super negative experience. It's like most of the time when you're playing Kate Kelly, they don't slam the Kelly turn one and you're looking at a handful of no answers. Like in formats where that kind of play is legal, you're probably got some answers, and most of the time it doesn't get you. But when it does, man, that's a negative play experience. I want to exist in a game where these crazy cards come out. Super Awesome Games takes big swings, and when they give us a stinker, well, maybe that's not fair. When they give us a nuclear bomb instead of an assault rifle, I want them to be able to go, hey, this one was a problem, let's delete it. And now Incursion is kind of the format that does that. So between Incursion and the featured format system, I'm actually, for all the criticism I've kind of worked through as I've thought out loud about this topic through the course of this show, I do actually feel really optimistic about overall how featured formats have been. I do have some criticisms. There's a few things I wish they would do differently. But that plus this new incursion system, which incursion's not where I want it to be yet, but it's not going to be there right away. It has to get there over time. And I'm willing to get. Now, I've said before, I wish they would have started incursion 3 years ago so that right now we would have the incursion that I think most of us want, but they didn't. And that's okay. So what now what? Let's move forward. The way these two formats interact with each other I think is really positive. And I think more than anything else, this lays out kind of a rock solid foundation that says we are never going to see another card banned and replaced ever. If you want to play in the kind of format where problem cards are deleted, there's incursion over here where you can play every card in your binder except for the ones that have been banned for being overplayed, problematic, etc. And if what you want to do is play in a novel, unique, probably mostly, but maybe not always balanced format, we have featured formats over here. So between the two of those, I've got almost exactly what I want. Now, I don't have everything I want in one single format, but that's okay. Like, life is all about compromises, So I overall I'm very, very positive. Honestly, the only thing that I think we really lack in terms of competitive play at this point is some kind of an official, organized draft module. Like if Upper Deck said, "Hey, this list of cards, this is your draft cube. This is the cards we want put in the cube. You shuffle these packs up like this is what we think would make a good draft. This is the featured format for this period is going to be a draft cube based on these cards. Now, I don't think they'll ever do a featured format as a draft cube. I think this would have to be its own thing because there's plenty of players who play constructed but don't want to play draft. Just like there's casual players who don't want to play competitive and competitive players who don't have time for casual. There are players who hate drafting cards, but I would like to see some kind of official support for a draft module, even if it's not for tournaments, even if it's like the very first featured formats we ever got from Super Awesome Games, and this is going way, way, way back, were just posted on Facebook. And it was just, hey, these are some ideas that we think would be fun. And well, I don't know for a fact that this was the motivation, but it felt like this was Super Awesome Games sort of giving us something to be excited about during the Legacy drought while we were waiting for that expansion to come out. And some of those formats were cool. Like the date night format, I really liked, where you get two main characters. C-Stacks brought that back at one of the Quarantine Cups. I don't remember which one, two. I think it was Quarantine Cup 2. Uh, I think that was the first appearance of the Ladies Night format where all the characters had to identify as female. So there's some really cool other formats that have kind of been thrown out as almost like cat. I say casual, but casual players probably don't care about these types of formats. But that's kind of where I think draft would fit. I think there's certain casual players who would be willing to play in a draft event, even though it's a little more competitive, just because it's different. You get to see different cards. I think that there's some competitive players who would love to play draft. And I think that there is a whole other skill set that exists within the world of draft in terms of card analysis without having to without being able to do the play testing. So when you do a constructed deck, you build your deck, you play some games, you adjust a few cards, you play some more games, adjust a few more, etc. It's an iterative process. Draft, you don't really get that. It is, here's your pile of cards and play. And it stands to reason that there would be people whose minds are better suited for the draft environment than for the constructed environment. And it'd be cool to be able to give those players a place to shine other than just a side event at Midwinter. Not to throw any shade at Peter. I appreciate your draft cubes that you have made for me, man, over the years. But I would like to see a little bit more, maybe not official, full on featured format like cash tournament style draft, but if Upper Deck could give us, honestly, the time that this would have been really nice would have been last year when we weren't receiving any cards at all. But I didn't have the idea that, I mean, I knew about the idea of draft cubes before, but the concept of Super Awesome Games saying, hey, this curated list of 366 cards or however many cards need to go into a draft cube. These are the cards that we think you should put into your cube. and these teams play well together. This one card from over here that's on a different team or came out of a different box. This should be in this pool. We should take these cards out. But like a curated draft experience where players at any level of casual to try hard could look at this list posted on the Upper Deck blog, make the cube themselves, create the packs, and then have a cool night with their friends or potentially do a tournament at their local game store. Even though I wish more cards would have been banned and replaced or just banned over the years, I think seeing Upper Deck or Super Awesome Games, I don't really know who has the final say on game balancing, but seeing the way that they've tried different things and constantly been looking for ways to create cool competitive experiences for us while also keeping an eye on the fact that some people really don't like it when you tell them they can't play with the cards they paid for. I'm a little more, hey, if it's a problem, ban it. Let's create novel. I lean more that way, but there's other people who, hey man, that's my favorite character. I bought this and now I can't play it. That sucks. And I understand that mindset. But overall, I think we've got a pretty good balance within the competitive formats of our game. Time will tell whether Incursion lives up to what I think it's going to live up to, but I'm very optimistic about it. Overall, I think featured formats are positive. And the one missing piece, again, just to put a button on it here, I would like to see some kind of official draft cubes put out by Upper Deck or Super Awesome Games to let players have that draft experience that's maybe been a little more curated than just me going, hey, let's take these four teams and throw them together into a box. If you like what we're doing here, you can tell your friends about our show, or you can go to patreon.com/thebuildphase and support what we're doing. Like super awesome people like Brad, Jason, Justin, Patrick, Peter, and Roland, as well as others supporting Build Phase at patreon.com/thebuildphase. This has been our extensive thinking out loud about game balance and the ban and replace concept within Versus. I am Mr. Ben, and you should go win some games.